Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited about hosting this first panel. I want to introduce our guest for the panel. Before I go individually, I just want to tell you that you're very fortunate today because you have some of the very top cybersecurity leaders across the federal government joining us. All of them are longtime friends and colleagues from the time when I was in uniform. These are superb leaders who are in critical roles, and they're just great Americans. So let me go ahead and begin by introducing them. First of all, we have Grant Schneider. He is the Senior Director for Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council, as well as Federal Chief Information Security Officer within the Office of Management and Budget. Prior to joining OMB, Grant served as the Director of Cybersecurity Policy on the National Security Council and as the Chief Information Officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency. Welcome, Grant.
Thank you very much.
Our next panel member is Jeanette Manfra. She serves as the National Protection and Programs Directorate Assistant Secretary of the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications. She is the Chief Cybersecurity Official for the Department of Homeland Security and supports its mission of strengthening the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. Jeanette has had an illustrious career at DHS, but from a very selfish perspective, she's also a former Army officer, and I want to thank you for your service and your continued service. And our final panel member is Mr. Rob Joyce. He's the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity Strategy to the Director of National Security Agency. Rob has worked at NSA for almost 30 years now, and he has held leadership positions in both NSA's cybersecurity and signals intelligence missions at NSA while receiving 3 presidential rank awards. Rob's previous assignment was as Special Assistant to the President and Cybersecurity Coordinator at the White House, affectionately known as the Cyber Czar. Please welcome all 3 of our panelists. Okay, so we will get right to it. Title for this panel is called Compete, Deter, and Win in Cyberspace, Perspectives on the 2018 National Cyber Strategy. So that's what we're here to talk about. And I would like to kick it off with Grant. From your perspective as the federal CISO, can you give us kind of a strategic overview of what the strategy is about and perhaps some of the coordination process that went into the development and the initiation of publicizing the strategy?
Yeah, so on September 20th, the President approved and we released the National Cyber Strategy. It's the first national strategy we've had in 15 years, so excited to have that out. From a process standpoint, quickly, very much an interagency participation effort, as Jeanette and Rob, because Rob was there at the White House when we did parts of this as well, can attest to. But essentially, we ran through an NSPM4 process, so we had a whole bunch of what we call policy coordination committee meetings to really develop what the structure of the strategy was going to look like and what the content was going to look like. And then we ended up flowing that up to what we call a principals committee meeting that the National Security Advisor, Ambassador Bolton, chaired with essentially the secretaries or the majority of the cabinet before the document went to the President for approval. So definitely something that has leadership buy-in, kind of built from the ground up of folks from across the agencies, and then has the leadership buy-in. And I would say that one of the questions I often get is sort of the what's different in this, or when people read the strategy, and I'm going to give you just a thumbnail on it in a second, you know, that a lot of it sounds very, very familiar. And part of that is because a lot of it is very, very familiar. And a lot of the initiatives of things we need to do are carryovers from previous administrations. Because in my mind, a lot of what we need to do in cybersecurity is doing the basic things, doing them very well, doing them day in and day out. There aren't necessarily shiny solutions to cybersecurity. What I think is different about this strategy is really a movement from policy and process to one of action and accountability. So we definitely want accountability to be a part of it. You will see that throughout the strategy, both from accountability inside the federal government, so taking care of our federal systems, accountability for malicious cyber actors wherever they may be in the world, and what are we doing about it, but also accountability for industry. So what are our expectations for industry as a whole, and perhaps even more importantly, industry that runs and operates our critical infrastructure across the nation that, of course, we are all dependent on for all our capabilities. We structured the national strategy around the national cyber strategy. We structured it after the national security strategy, so it aligns to the 4 pillars there: protect Americans, the American way, and the American people. And that really gets to federal cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, promoting American prosperity. So how do we continue the capabilities that we need that have brought us the prosperity that the internet has? A big element in there is workforce, which is, we think, a significant challenge inside the federal government, but across the nation. How do we ensure that all our organizations have a labor pool that we can hire from appropriately? The third pillar is preserve peace through strength. So this starts to get into how are we working with our international partners? What are we doing from potentially an offensive perspective in cyber? Because there are certainly capabilities we need to bring to bear. But how do we use those as part of all our overarching national capabilities? And then finally, advancing American influence. Again, how do we ensure that the intellectual property that we're developing inside our country is going to continue to drive innovations going forward? So quick snapshot on the strategy. We're excited to have it out, and now we're working towards the implementation challenges and opportunities there.
Thanks, Grant. And I'll transition here to Jeanette and the DHS perspective. So maybe both of you could first talk about how you're working together as federal CISO and senior cybersecurity official at DHS to bring additional capabilities and accountability across the federal landscape.
You can start.
Okay.
Thank
you. So from a DHS perspective, our focus is very much on risk management. The DHS cyber strategy was released in May. And if you sort of think of the National Cyber Strategy as the overarching document for the entire government, and then each agency having their pieces of that, and you've seen some like DoD and other energy, I believe, have been publishing strategies. So from our perspective, we're looking at it from being the risk manager, both for federal cybersecurity, the civilian enterprise, as well as as critical infrastructure and the broader kind of internet ecosystem. And so on the federal cybersecurity side, and this is coming from DHS, we see OMB as kind of leading in terms of coordinating and issuing policies. And where DHS fits is taking those policies, and whether that means we issue implementation guidance or directives, which we have the authority to do for other civilian agencies, or taking the resources that we've been appropriated by Congress to actually buy and deploy tools to agencies. And we do that through 2 primary programs. One is the National Cyber Protection System, sometimes affectionately referred to as Einstein. And so these are sensors that we're deploying throughout government, and then, or continuous diagnostics and mitigation. And they're 2 unique programs, and particularly on Einstein, I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail. We can talk afterwards if you're interested. As we migrate to certain systems to the cloud, we'll definitely be re-engineering how we think about having visibility on traffic that goes in and out of government networks and blocking that. But CDM for us is really about standardizing tool sets, as well as providing just greater visibility that the government has ever had, both within agencies but also for DHS, that really leads to that accountability, but also being able to provide tools and capabilities for agencies to be better. So one example that we talk about a lot is vulnerability management. And to Grant's point about sort of doing the basics right. One of the key things that we've learned through years of assessments in both federal agencies, critical infrastructure, is we just sort of continue to have poor patch management processes. And that's usually resources and a variety of things. It's very boring to talk about, but it is also one of the most important things that you can do to deter adversaries getting into and maintaining presence in your networks. And because we had the ability to independently sort of scan and audit whether agencies were patching external facing systems, we issued our very first directive and said you need to patch critical vulnerabilities within 30 days. And we've kept that directive in place for 3 years. Not only did that reduce our total number of vulnerabilities that the government was, these are known critical vulnerabilities that were not being patched. I'm not going to give you the timeline of how long it was taking agencies to patch, but it was not exactly a strong standard. After 3 years of having this directive in place, we have maintained a consistent time to patch of 20 to 24 days across federal agencies, which is just, it's enormous. It's a very simple, sort of very tangible thing to focus on that we were able to independently measure, hold agencies accountable, not as if they didn't want to be held accountable to this, they just didn't necessarily have the sort of prioritization and the focus from their leadership on this. And that sort of action and sort of similar actions, whether that's DMARC, moving our websites to HTTPS, these are very tangible things that we can do, and by being able to independently measure them and providing those reports and lining it up according to NIST standards and OMB guidance, you can start to see this sort of trifecta of really being able to close these critical issues within federal agencies. So that's sort of a mix between kind of the strategy, but also how we're doing that at the implementation level. And we're continuing to look for what are these enterprise level risks that we have, high focus on high value assets, and what do we do? How do we increase the level of security, and how do we direct our limited resources towards fixing those areas, and ideally, frankly, being a leader for all of industry. For DMARC, we led industry, and we continue to lead industry in adoption of DMARC as an example of how federal agencies can actually lead in this space.
Thanks.
And can I just quickly add in on the accountability piece, because as Jeanette talked about, what we found, and one of the tools OMB brings to bear, is that we think a lot of the cyber challenges are management challenges and are getting senior leaders' attention, but understanding what to have them focus their attention on. And so the challenge is giving them some metrics that are meaningful, because leaders can clearly say, I'm at yellow and I would like to be at green, right? That makes sense. And so we've got to put the right stuff in front of them. And I would say the collaboration we have with DHS is we have no policies that come out of OMB around cybersecurity. Well, I would say all the policies that come out of OMB around cybersecurity have been closely worked with the interagency, but especially with DHS even before we go to the interagency for comment. And DHS looks at them from, okay, how can we actually implement this? It's great to have policies, but if we can't implement it, and we can't measure it, and we can't track it, then maybe we don't want to go down that path. And it allows us to have a more broad policy that can be more enduring, and then DHS can come out with some amplifying guidance of how that implementation is going to take place. And then we, from an OMB standpoint, can get the President's Management Council, which is a deputy secretary level group, and hold them accountable and give them metrics and measures and scorecards to be able to say, hey, go back, meet your CIO and CISO if you don't know who they are. Hopefully they already know who they are. But go meet them, sit down, and have these types of conversations, because it's going to enhance your security.
As a federal CISO from that position, you got a lot of folks in this audience who can help in this effort. What would you say is your biggest challenge in helping Jeanette and DHS do all of these things that she described, these priorities? What's your biggest challenge, and what would you ask for help on?
So I would say feedback on what are the right measures and metrics that are valuable to you for running your day-to-day operations and enhancing your level of cybersecurity, and things that are going to be meaningful from a leadership standpoint. So we often get beat up that OMB is only worried about compliance and all your measures are about compliance activities. as opposed to things enhancing security. We have forums. We have a federal Chief Information Security Officer Council. This is sort of, you get to write your own test and help give us the metrics you'd like to be measured against that are going to help you do your job. So I would say be heavily involved with those opportunities, because that can steer things so that you're having the conversation with your leadership you really want to have, as opposed to I got a bad scorecard, my FITAR scorecard sucks, what are you doing about it, when that measures things that you may or may not have any control over.
I could just add a couple of things, because I know there's a mix of federal CISOs. I've seen a couple, and industry in the audience. Probably the biggest challenge for, and I can talk to civilian agencies, because that's my area of responsibility, is just limited resources that will become increasingly limited. And one of the most important things that we try to focus on is this is not an IT problem, this is a mission problem. And so helping agency leadership, so that it's not that the CISOs or the CIOs don't want to do these things. They know the things, but they don't have the resources or they don't have the support. So we've been very focused on helping various different stakeholders in the appropriations process or the leadership and partnership with OMB is about defining what is critical to an agency mission. This is really just about taking the NIST cyber framework and adopting it in the federal agencies. But it's not just the CIO's problem to solve. This is a risk to the entire agency, and you have to think about how what the agency's mission is and how important it is to secure that, and think about how you resource that, which means you have to prioritize, of course. The other thing that I would say to industry in the room is, there are an increasing plethora of security tools that are out there, and we wish we could buy them all. But it is. No,
really, we don't. I don't want all of them. I'm sorry.
I'm just kidding. I don't. But actually, the point is that what's from my perspective, it's the increase in tools is great. It's good to see a cybersecurity market that's flourishing and seeing innovation. But we need more automation, we need more orchestration, we need more integration of these capabilities. It is nearly impossible. Some agencies don't even have a SOC. And to think about, as we've been deploying these continuous monitoring tools, a lot of what we had to focus resources on was helping agencies build the governance processes, help with the integration of these tools. We spend a lot of resources on the integration part. And so sort of my kind of, I guess, call from a, sort of a federal agency need is, while it's great to see innovation, just being in a position where you're trying to decipher and buy between hundreds and different sets of tools that do one little thing, but you don't have a common platform that can integrate all of those and have people doing the things that people should be doing, which is analysis, and instead we've got people doing the things that I'd rather have computers be doing. And so that's sort of what I guess I generally kind of like to say to the industry folks in the room.
Thanks, Jeanette. You talked earlier about some of the priorities, Einstein, CDM, that are mainly inwardly focusing on federal government. Mm-hmm. The national strategy talks about connectivity with industry, particularly critical infrastructure, with international relationships. Are there some priorities there from a DHS perspective that you'd like to share with the audience?
Absolutely. So we think of ourselves focused in 3 areas. First is federal cybersecurity, which we've talked a lot about, and a lot of our resources go towards that. Second, critical infrastructure, and then the third being sort of the broader ecosystem. How do we kind of, while we're defending the somewhat hard to defend today, we have to create a better tomorrow, and how do we sort of build a more secure ecosystem over the long run? And that's, the NSTAC, the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, is working on something called the Moonshot. How do we have this kind of long-term effort? But we're very focused on how do we understand the risk that our country faces today, and how do we sort of mobilize our collective resources. And that's not just DHS's resources, it's industry resources, it's our intelligence community, it's DoD, sort of looking across the space to how do we sort of collectively defend against the risk. The first part, though, is understanding what that risk is. Over years of doing this at DHS, we've got a lot of insight into how the industry actually works, how these critical infrastructure sectors work. But the big step that we really needed to take was have a clear understanding of what does the industry think their risk is, and do we have that same understanding? And then what do we do about it? So we've talked about the financial services sector, how they've sort of developed their system, the financial services the ARC. I can't remember what it stands for. That's awful. But sort of focusing on things like systemic risk with enough specificity to be able to do something about it, whether that's deploy indicators and warnings between industry and government, and again, not just DHS, but DHS being in that position to truly understand, characterize risk, and then bring all of the different sort of people together, stakeholders together, and that's why the Secretary announced the National Risk Management Center at the July summit. And so it's focusing on things like, do we understand the risk to the financial sector? Do we understand the risk to supply chain? And then again, what are the things that we can do about it, both now and also in the future, to make it more secure? So that's sort of where we're focusing. We're building something called the National Critical Functions. Some of you probably participating in this is working and having industry define what do they believe their critical functions are. And then do we understand what the risk to those functions? Do we understand how an adversary would manipulate those functions? And when we talk about functions, it's things like having clean water, having communications that you can depend upon, having an electric grid, having elections that we can have faith in, those sorts of things. And what are the dependencies? And this is not just about cyber. We're looking at it from across the board because that's how adversaries look at it. But they're going to probably use some sort of cyber vector to have an influence. And so trying to kind of characterize it, but starting from what are these critical functions that our citizens and those who live here really depend upon, and what our government depends upon, and organizing ourselves to defend those, both within the government and collectively with industry. And to your point about international partners, we're heavily invested in working with international partners. We've issued, over the past few months, the first ever joint alert with the UK. We did that in the springtime. We've just recently, we've issued, in coordination with all our Five Eyes partners, alerts around publicly available hacking tools. And so we want to continue to do that, to leverage the capabilities and the resources that we have, again, across the international partners collectively, but also to be building this, what I would call a, coalition of like-minded countries who want to preserve the internet that has, frankly, created so many amazing things for all of us.
Thanks, Jeanette. And I think most of us understand that when you talk about risk, it's a combination of understanding what capabilities are important to protect and defend, understanding the vulnerabilities associated with those, and understanding the threats. And so I'd like to transition to Rob, and from an intelligence community and DoD perspective, what are some of the highest risk nations, and what have they been doing? What damage has been caused? And how does NSA not only understand these threats, but operationalize the results of that understanding?
Great. So I think it won't surprise anybody as to the big four we're worried about, right? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. When you step back and talk about international norms, who's behaving badly on the internet, it really comes down to four nations. And those are the four that are operating beyond the bounds of what we would consider reasonable. You've got Russia going after the electric grid in their near neighbors, and even attempting implants on some of our critical infrastructure. You've got the election meddling. You've got things like China with massive volumes of capabilities coming at times still our intellectual property and our defense industrial base. Iran has always been a country that doesn't look to follow the rest of the almost civilized world, has been attacking Saudi Arabia, came at our banks years ago. And we worry with the new nuclear non-proliferation stance that their attacks against the Western world, to include the US, will rise. And then North Korea, where you've got a nation state stealing hard currency, right? They're bank robbers. So those are the big ones. And then there's a whole host of criminal and other activity. We worry about violent extremist organizations and terrorists as well. So one of the things the intel community is trying to do is look out over the horizon outside the networks that the governments and our critical infrastructure owns and operates, and tries to reach out and understand what tools, capabilities, tradecraft those nations are bringing. And then we do multiple things, right? We inform action. We help share indicators, tools, and understanding to DHS, to the broader DoD, out into the critical infrastructure. A lot of the things you see DHS put out, right, is fueled by the intel community, NSA, DoD, CIA, and others, taking classified information and then obfuscating the sources and methods, but getting it out in both capabilities and warnings. We help inform big national strategies as to how we're going to run campaigns against some of these threats. And that's our intent, is to take the power and the knowledge that we can bring from the intel community and seek to operationalize it, because knowledge that we just sit, study, and report on is of no use if somebody's not operationalizing it.
You know, it's amazing to me that the level of transparency, increasing transparency, that today we talk about threats that several years ago this would have been a classified discussion.
But John, I didn't surprise anybody here.
No.
Not one person.
I think it's entirely appropriate, this evolution that we're having in increased transparency for many different reasons. But from the perspective of working together between the intelligence community, DHS, protecting critical infrastructure, just wondering if you could share your perspective on this relationship, and if you could include what I think is an increasingly important part of that is the integration of industry and the threat intelligence you're getting from industry. I mean, most cybersecurity companies have an intelligence component to it. And my perspective is they're pretty darn good at it these days. So any perspectives there?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think, you know, on the intelligence community cooperation, it's gotten tremendously better, and the transparency as well, I think, is helpful. You know, for years, industry would say, well, I want information from the intelligence community. I'm like, well, where do you think this stuff is coming from? And, you know, it's just, you know, for various reasons, we didn't talk about that too much. So I think it's good to have more transparency, is that the government is actually working together. We don't kind of go into the nuts and bolts of how it all works for, I would think, obvious reasons. But, you know, for a long time, one of our closest partners has been the NSA. And so what has evolved, though, over the past decade, wow, I've been there for almost 11 years at DHS, is that the increasing transparency, increasing sort of capacity and capability at DHS, but also the increasing market, in where you don't just have threat intelligence companies, you have regular critical infrastructure companies that have their own threat intelligence capability that they're willing to share. And so I think, and hopefully Rob agrees with me, you know, I think instead of us sort of very focused in the government on, you know, indicators of compromise and trying to sort of share as many indicators as possible, the government is really better positioned to focus on the context, the TTPs of an actor, why they're doing these things, and we're getting a sort of much better sharing around the actual indicators themselves, both within industry and with industry and government, so that, you know, people can start to automate their defenses against these known IOCs, so we can start worrying about the harder things, like how do we stop the campaigns, how do we stop how do we share information around TTPs, those sorts of things. That's a little bit harder and more sophisticated, I would say. The other thing that we've always sort of thought about is, within the government, you have like an intelligence collection production cycle that we all sort of understand very well, and you've got producers and you've got consumers. I'm pretty much exclusively a consumer of intelligence. And there's a cycle where you have the consumers sort of lay out, here's some of my requirements, and the intelligence community tries to collect against those and fill those gaps. And I've long thought that critical infrastructure needs to be thought of as a consumer of intelligence as well. And how do we sort of orient ourselves within the government to be able to react to that, all abiding within all of our current authorities. And so that's sort of the next big step for us. And the unclassified space is really, really rich. There's a lot of unclassified open source information that we can operationalize and that our partners in the government really can enrich with additional information and to get that better picture.
And I think it's also our partners in industry, right? I mean, I think this is all about roles and responsibilities, and cyber is still relatively an immature discipline, and that we haven't figured out, what is the role that a critical infrastructure owner should make, or what is the role that their suppliers should be playing with cybersecurity? What is that, Jeanette mentioned, the unique pieces that the government brings to bear? Because, John, 15 years ago, companies didn't have, intelligence, elements inside of them, and so people would have looked to the government for that. But I think we have to, as we move forward, what is it that Rob and DoD and NSA can sort of go out and collect? What is the role of DHS? And then what is the role of different service providers and different owners and operators? And we just have to continue to work through that.
Yeah.
Rob, any thoughts on the integration of commercial and government intelligence?
Well, I think it's vital because if you look at NSA, we have a foreign intelligence mission. We're very strictly focused outward, right? And the critical infrastructure owners and operators are not the government. They are, for the most part, private industry. Yet they have the logs, the sensors, the data about what's knocking at their door each and every day. And so their ability to understand that, tip us to look out over the horizon, it is a powerful partnership. And we're trying to do everything we can to enable that partnership. And then the things we learn forward about the tradecraft, the tools, the intent, is essential information for them to focus resources on hardening and improving, battening down the hatches when we expect bad weather ahead for them.
Yeah. Speaking about transparency, I'm gonna ask Rob to stretch himself a little bit here. The new national strategy and the accompanying DoD cyber strategy take a little bit more aggressive approach. I was wondering what you can tell us about that. What should we take from that?
Yeah, so I think flowing down from the President's national security strategy, you'll see some words that talk about peace through strength. You'll see that echoed in the national cybersecurity strategy. You'll see it in some of the DoD strategies. There's a lot of effort that goes into defending the networks from the perimeter inward, right? And that's the hygiene, the protections we have to do, whether it's advanced capabilities all the way down to just doing the basics that are so effective and so needed. But there's the question of how often do you want everybody to get what I'd call free shots on goal, right? The ability to come at the time and place of their choosing without contest and rattle the doorknobs and probe the defenses and find out where you're strong and where you're weak. And so part of the DoD cyber strategy is looking at making this a contested environment, right? Making the objectives of coming at our critical infrastructure, our government networks, our defense industrial base challenging. And that starts inside the networks, hunting and probing, pushing people out. But it also starts in a DoD term where we say left of boom, right? Before they have the chance to go and do that. And so you'll see DoD with a strategy talking about continuous engagement. And that's the concept of going out and making the adversary's life harder. And some of that is as simple as taking their tradecraft tools and TTPs and working with industry to publicize both in unclassified overt ways and working with them behind the scenes to make sure they're not successful and to take away their capabilities. Then we're also looking at what DoD and other parts of the government can do out in gray and red space. We've always done some of those operations. What you're seeing is a focus on trying to learn and figure out what's been effective and what do we need to do. Because I think everybody here will agree that more of the same is unacceptable, right? We can't stay on the same path we've been on. That trend line is going in the wrong direction. So, I'm a firm believer that, hack back, cyber hack is escalatory, not de-escalatory, which is one of the reasons we believe that's an inherently governmental operation. But it also is a necessary tool as part of a big, broad, overall government portfolio. We've got to impose costs, so the cost value of doing things against our government, our critical infrastructure, no longer favors the folks who would come at us. And in doing that, that means working with the legal judicial system to impose sanctions and impose indictments and arrests and use that power of law enforcement. But it's also the sanctions tools. It's the diplomatic tools. It's
the whole toolkit, yeah.
It's the imposed cost by denial. It's all the things we can do inside the networks. And an element of that is the offensive cyber and some of the capabilities the government can bring to that space.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We have an old saying in the military, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So this is a big plan, this new strategy. Let's talk about implementation. You talked a little bit about it, but inside your organizations and across federal government, what are the mechanisms that you're using to measure progress? Are we making progress on these pillars associated with the strategy? How do you do that?
So we're already in contact with the enemy. I think that's a continual in this space. And you're right, John, the strategy is great to have, and it's a good unifying function, and I think it's a call to action internal to the government and for the nation as a whole, as well as our international partners that we work closely with. From an implementation standpoint, we are now at NSC, we're running an implementation plan development process. It's not going to be a glossy that gets posted on the website for a couple reasons. Most importantly, we don't want our adversaries to know what our implementation plan is. Secondarily, we want to leverage things that are already in flight. And there is a lot ongoing, whether it's in the Department of Homeland Security, across the federal government, within the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, to already implement aspects of this strategy. And indeed, we talked a little bit about a lot of them have been enduring for a number of years. And so we want to leverage and capitalize on those efforts going forward and really figure out what are the things that we need to put a lot more leadership attention on, and which are the things that just need to continue happening and almost under the radar. And so we're looking at, in federal government specifically, the president signed Executive Order 13800 that had 15 different deliverables. Due to him, one of those was around IT modernization. And so we're continuing to implement the IT modernization report recommendations. That ties very nicely into the national cyber strategy. Turns out if you have the same people write a couple different documents, you get a lot of synergy between those documents. And so we're continuing along those areas and looking at what are the measures and what are the metrics that we need to hold people accountable to. But you guys see this from a
There's a lot in there. But as Grant said, we all did work together, so it's not as if it was a surprise. And we really sort of focused on these are the set of activities that we want to accomplish in this administration, and it does build on decade-plus work of previous administrations, and so we have a great base to build from. And but it's a lot. We're very focused on sort of, like I said, about that sort of top. What are those critical functions? How are we defending those critical functions? What's the risk to those? And how do we better posture government and industry to instrument our various different capabilities to be able to defend those. And so sort of all the, all those different initiatives and other that you see is really, from our perspective, it's really kind of coming up into this overarching concept of how do we manage risk to the country. And so what you see are various different efforts that kind of all have a different piece of that, which we were already investing in, and which we will, with Congress's permission, continue to invest in.
So I'd come in a different way, John. I'd say, the key enablers for me are three things. One is leadership, drive, and attention, right? And I think you've seen recently from the executive level down a willingness to focus on cyber and do hard things. We talked this morning about DoD saying, we're going to shift to Win 10, right? That was not an easy transition. It was a hard decision. DoD CIO, DepSecDef, SecDef put their spine behind and said, no, I know it's painful, I know it's hard, but we're going to do it because it will substantially improve the department's security. It sounds pedestrian, but that one step was hugely important to improve cybersecurity. And it was not a technical decision, it was a leadership decision. Second thing beyond leadership is resources and authorities. And commensurate with that, you see things like the stand-up of Cyber Command. You see the federal budget emphasizing and including the budgets to do what we need to do in cybersecurity. DoD right now is evaluating things like key codes and crypto, the traditional things we use to protect classified information, and talking about what resources we need to enhance in that space to make sure we're secure in the future. And then authorities, you can look at things like the Presidential Policy Directive 20 was the governing document that oversaw cyber operations, both offensive and defensive. We rewrote that recently. It was characterized at times of we've thrown out PPD 20 and people imagine this Wild West, everybody hack everything. It wasn't. It was a thoughtful rewrite that puts new process and policy in place, improving what we've done for several years based on that experience and knowledge. And I don't expect this to be the last and best and final cyber operations policy ever. What it does is it streamlines some of those operations, removes some bureaucracy, and we're going to learn and improve going from there. So, leadership, attention, resources, and authorities, and I think those are all coming together.
Okay. One quick question before we get into the wrap-up. Accountability. You all mentioned accountability. Back when I was in service, probably one of the most difficult challenges is putting consequence to bad behavior, and especially at the leadership levels. So just an assessment, how are we doing? I mean, this is specifically designed to promote accountability at the right levels. And you talked about leadership and why this is such an important factor in making progress and measuring progress. How are we doing in holding leaders accountable?
So I'll start. I think the first element of that is understanding what good and bad behavior are, right? Again, what am I holding people accountable to? I think we have the opportunity. We certainly have leadership that wants to be held accountable, that wants to hold people accountable. We are leveraging the President's management agenda, the PMA through the President's Management Council as one of the mechanisms where we have regular engagement with senior leaders at agencies to hold people accountable. The challenge is that I think when people say hold accountable, they're waiting for the public firings. And quite frankly, those don't happen in industry very often, and they happen less often in government. And so there are lots of ways to hold people accountable that aren't necessarily going to make headlines. I think it is more of a culture shift, though, and a behavior shift to, what am I doing, but also what is my leadership doing to hold each other accountable going forward.
Anybody else?
I think the only thing I would add is you can't have really productive accountability if you don't have the tools to measure it and to provide leaders those tools. So whether that's an agency head that's accountable, or the CEO, or the leaders of other nations, You know, from our perspective, I think the ability to hold people accountable in a productive way has been fueled a lot by the deployment of tools and metrics and better understanding of how to even measure whether you're doing a good job in cybersecurity, which is always a hard thing to do. But to, you know, look at sort of, here's the kind of indicators of what a good cybersecurity program is, and here's the risk to your agency. You know, we talk, you know, the same with companies. Do you understand what the risk is? Have you sort of documented the risk choices that you've made? You know, did you deploy your resources in accordance with those? If you sort of, because there's not really a sort of standard of care, those are sort of the stand-ins that I think we have. And if people go through that process and they do it, you know, they do it diligently and they monitor it, and they empower those who have the actual programs to implement, you know, then there's some breaches are going to happen. And things it's just a fact of life. So it's not necessarily about sort of, do we fire somebody because a breach happened? It's about sort of a continuous accountability of you're responsible for these systems. You're responsible for managing this risk. Did you do this appropriately? Give them the tools to do that. And then, and I guess the last part that I think is still something we're figuring out is when we start to talk about things like national risk, there's a shared accountability between government and the private sector, the federal government and state and locals. And that's something that we're working really hard to clarify what those lines are. Because if you're truly talking about something that is a risk to the nation, you know, most critical infrastructure owners and operators get into the business knowing that they are managing something that's critical to the country. But what are those lines of accountability and what are those expectations? Clarify the expectations that industry should have of government, what our role is going to be in managing an incident, what our role should be on the prevention side. So that's a part of accountability that I think we really going to focus and prioritize in our relationship with industry.
One final question. You are some of the top cybersecurity leaders across government. So key takeaways. What is the one thing you want this audience to leave understanding that you think is most important for them to understand?
Rob, you want to start?
All right, I'll start, jump on that grenade. Cybersecurity is not a technology problem, it's a leadership problem, right? It is the attention, the resources, the focus of leaders to do that accountability, but to set the ethos. When you look at where we fail in cybersecurity today, most of the time it's the failure to do something that was known and understood that we have to do, but it either wasn't resourced or it wasn't a priority. So for me, the takeaway is leadership, and that's in government, in private industry, even in your own personal account, right? Choosing to use a password manager with random, strong, large passwords instead of the simple, easy, single one you remember, right? It's leadership and accountability for all of us.
Jeanette?
I guess agree with Rob. The thing I would add to that is it's shared risk. And hopefully I've driven home the point that we care about risk and we're trying to manage risk. But this is really about shared risk that consumers, individuals, companies, governments, not just the United States government, but other governments, we're all actors in an environment that is vulnerable, and we have a shared risk and we have a responsibility to defend it and create a more secure environment. Our secretary says a lot, your risk is my risk is your risk, and that's to us, that's what it's really about, is how do we understand this shared risk and how do we actually do something about it?
Grant?
So along those lines, go do something about it. Like, don't just come to these symposiums. It's great to learn, it's great to network, but what are you going to do about it? Because there is no Mr. or Ms. accountability that's going to come hold people accountable or that's going to come make your systems more secure. So really walk out of here and think through what are the 2 or 3 things that I can do with my behavior that I can do to help hold my peers accountable, that I can help hold and influence people that are maybe 2 or 3 levels away from me. But what are we doing about it? Because we often get caught in the they will come do something. Someone from the White House will make it all happen. Probably unlikely. Someone from DHS will save me. Someone from NSA is just going to make the bad guys all go away. None of those are likely to be long-term outcomes. So what are you doing about it? Write some things down and then go implement.
Well, I want to thank each of you for sharing your insight with us today. God bless you for what you do every single day. And I would just like to end by asking for a round of applause. Thank you very much for your work.